Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video we're going to be covering an official English translation of an interview between Famitsu Magazine over in Japan and several members of the development team for Final Fantasy Origin. This includes creative producer Tetsuya Nomura, producer Jin Fujiwara, and director Daisuke Ino. Mind you that there are those types of roles for both Square Enix and for Team Ninja / Koei Tecmo, so we're going to be getting some insight into a lot of different people's minds, I suppose, with this interview. Before we go any further, by the way, backup camera, original one, a bit of technical issues. I know that's going to be in the comment section. But it's so strange to see an official interview being translated and posted on the main site. I'm wondering if this is because the reception to the trailer during E3 may not have been the strongest. So getting more information out that can actually circulate through people like myself or media sites, if they're putting a lot of value into that and giving people more information about what they can expect from the finished product, or for the people who don't have PlayStation 5s and just have to get all their information secondhand because they can't try the demo. Or they couldn't try it in the first 2 days anyway. So we're going to be diving into this Q&A. I covered this in another video with an unofficial translation, but bam, we have the official translation. So let's get into it. So they start by talking about the title, like what is Paradise? What does the title even mean? And this is where they confirm that this is not like a prequel or a sequel to Final Fantasy 1 in any way. In fact, in another interview or in another comment, Nomura mentioned how it's kind of more like a side story. But realistically, they're just using Final Fantasy 1 and the setting as a motif. So you'll see a lot of familiar elements. You'll see characters that look like Garland. You'll hear names like Chaos, Cornelia. We'll probably see the Four Fiends, but this is not in any way supposed to explain Final Fantasy 1. At least that's what we're being told here. It is just a motif. So in the original Final Fantasy 1, Warriors of Light go on to face Garland and Chaos and all this. But Jack and his friends are strangers in a sense. So are they Warriors of Light? That's really what the story is going to be focusing around. As for Paradise, this entire world in Final Fantasy 1 is basically considered a paradise, and they are not from this world. This only feeds the speculation that this game is in some way an isekai, that these characters maybe were playing the game or doing something related to this world and found themselves like sucked in, and now they have to complete this entire mission. There's just something about them that doesn't belong. And they talk about that a lot in the rest of the interview. This very next question is like it's a new story using Final Fantasy 1 as a motif rather than being connected or equivalent. They'll even have similar pacing. For example, the Chaos Shrine is one of the first destinations in Final Fantasy 1, and it's one of the first destinations in Final Fantasy Origin as well. But they also talk about how like their outfits here and their names are, all have hidden meanings about their origins and their story that they're not going to cover because it would obviously be a spoiler. But you know what? They don't seem to really care that much about spoilers in some regard because they pretty openly just talk about kind of the entire plot of Final Fantasy 1, or at least, what you can scrap together after you've actually finished Final Fantasy 1. The entire point of that game being that Garland would go back and forth in time constantly with the Four Fiends in order to make sure that he can never die and that conflict would constantly raise again and again and again. And for some reason, they asked if this is somehow connected to why the characters look the way that they do. And Nomura says, people probably imagine that, it's the Warriors of Light from Final Fantasy 1. But, look at these guys. They're clearly not those guys. But they also say that if you're familiar with the premise of Final Fantasy 1, you might be able to pick up some clues about the designs of Jack and the others. Dragoon's not even in there, so the fact that Jack can become that is a surprise. Yeah, we have Monk and Thief here, I suppose, so I guess those are, Final Fantasy 1 references. He can become Warrior, and there's also Black Mage, I guess, so I don't know. Nothing about their design screams to me that, I can pick up some clues. I don't know, maybe it'll make more sense to me later. But even says that the initial outfits are nothing more than to be like, hey, we're not from here. This is their plain state and they can wear armor over everything. So this like t-shirt looking dude, you won't even see him like this pretty much for 99% of the game. So just consider it his plain state. Maybe when they say references, they mean things like the armor. If you were to think back to like Final Fantasy 1 and you see again more motifs in place, but I ain't got nothing, man. They just look like they're isekai'd into the game. That's all there really is to it. Let's see. They also said they wanted to create a big contrast to what people would think about when they think of the Warriors of Light fighting Garland in Final Fantasy 1. They have a similar mission, but they needed people to know these are not exactly the same characters. These are not stand-ins for the Final Fantasy 1 characters. They really want to make sure they nail it home that it is a motif and not a prequel or a sequel or necessarily even connected in any way. They don't want them to look like heroes. That's what they say right here. But they don't want to talk too much about it. All of their names even have a meaning, but they said that would be a spoiler. Jack, Ash, and Jet have the same meaning hidden in their names. I still just think that it's because the Final Fantasy 1 character limit for names was 4, and they all have less than that. Maybe they were sitting in front of their NES, and they were about to start playing the game together, and they got sucked in, and who even knows? Now all the isekai theories are just going to keep running rampant as far as I'm concerned. So the next thing is about party members, and they cover this in a few different sections of the interview. The first one just confirms there are more than just Jet and Ash as party members, but that you'll only ever have a party of 3 fighting at any given time. But depending on where you are in the game, what fight it is, you might be swapping around party members, or you might just naturally experience different party members altogether. So thank you to Interview for helping us confirm that. It looked like they were even surprised. They were like, really? Oh, that's not the answer I was expecting. They then go over the logo, about how they have that classic Final Fantasy white, the Stranger of Paradise logo looks very Final Fantasy, but the colors, the dark, the red, all of that, to really let people know that it's a more adult, bloody, angry game, and it has dark, blackened emotions in Nomura's own words. So, I mean, that's cool. That's for me, that was kind of evident, so I don't really have much to say about it. Then they talk about how the dude in the demo just says that he is not Garland, but that he would become Chaos, and they don't comment on it. So he's kind of just saying he's not Garland. I don't know if that's just because he's lost his mind already, but he said, please wait to find out. So I guess that's what I'll do. All right. Anyway, next they talk about the gameplay, and very specifically, trying to create a Final Fantasy that's like this. But they also needed to know, did they start with the idea of creating a new Final Fantasy game? Did they create it from the story perspective, from the gameplay perspective? What was the most important thing? So I remember talking about this in my unofficial translation. Nomura originally just wanted to make a story about an angry man, like a gritty story about an angry man. It says it right here. And then the team at Team Ninja and at Square Enix, the teams wanted to work together on something new after working on Dissidia Final Fantasy and the arcade version, and also Dissidia NT for all this time. So Team Ninja's good at action games, so they decided, all right, let's do an action RPG. And then Nomura wanted it to be a game that barely even needed the Final Fantasy name. Like, for example, Stranger of Paradise, that's like kind of his like non-Final Fantasy related name for it, where he just wanted the action gameplay focused on fighting through dungeons. After being refined a little bit, we get basically the finished concept with Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy, but that a lot of his original concepts still remain. So as long as I understand it, Nomura, as long as it's not too crazy and I can understand it, that's all I am going to ask. And then the interviewer even mentions that, Team Ninja, that means I'd expect the best of Neo and the best of Final Fantasy if you're going to be having these teams work together. So the biggest things here, what parts of Final Fantasy were you certain you had to include? They very specifically said that it needed to have a good story. There needed to be a balance in the pacing. There needed to be, a good flow to the action combat, but it needed to have a solid story befitting an RPG. So hopefully that comes to fruition, because the demo, again, doesn't really leave a whole lot to, I guess it leaves a lot to be desired more so. It just doesn't leave a lot to the imagination. We just see this Final Fantasy 1 motif, chaos, chaos, chaos. So I think they really need to find a way to convey this outside of just saying it in interviews over and over again. Perhaps in the follow-up demo, perhaps in follow-up trailers, but they need to get across that it actually does even have a story in the first place, because they're not off to a good start on that front. Then they talk about a lot of challenging action games can be relatively lacking in story, but because it's written by Kazushige Nojima, they expect a lot of depth. Is there? And Inoue says, I think the story has plenty of depth. We'll be the judge of that, but they seem very, very reassured. I remember that Nojima in their developer comment talks about how they wrote one line for Jack, and from that point on, it was like they were in a haze, and they just wrote the rest of it, and it was like it flew off the pen, like the pen onto the paper, although I'm sure he typed it up actually, who knows. He seems really enthusiastic about what he's done with the story here. We'll have to see how it actually pans out. Then the next thing the interviewer goes over is the Final Fantasy series mostly consists of RPGs, so they expect that fans might struggle with action games like this. And this is where they talk about the accessibility of the game for the next several questions. I covered this in basically my review of it. One of our aims in combining Final Fantasy with the challenging action genre is to make these games more accessible. Players can get a taste of a rewarding, challenging action games, so our ultimate aim is to develop it as challenging rather than punishing. And that's actually a good way to refer to it, because a lot of the times with Soulsborns or anything like that, then you almost expect that death comes with this major, major penalty. Losing all your souls, needing to travel back, losing half your health bar until you can, use a certain item. Or there's some sort of major, major drawback to death in every single one of them. However, they give some specific examples. They really wanted to limit the penalty for dying. He says it's quite lenient. And they also wanted to make sure that things like evading, guarding, and soul shielding would be relatively easy to perform successfully, so they don't have mega tight windows of frames in which they can actually be used. They should feel fluid. They should feel accessible. And that's a really good example because I took that away from the demo. It was really easy for me to soul shield and swap to another job and have more break gauge, or make sure that I was evading some attacks and guarding, and then you can perfect guard and do a gap closer. And there's basically a ton of different options, and all of them function with relative ease. And I think they definitely achieved that. And the penalty for dying is barely existent at all. You lose max MP in the higher difficulties, and that's honestly all there is to it. There's even a casual mode, which they make mention, which removes a lot of the even more difficult stuff. There's no unblockables in casual mode. There's no MP loss on death in casual mode. So they really made sure they had as many difficulty options as possible that reduced the punishment that the game would give you for making a mistake, but still making sure that at least in terms of where you expect to be in terms of your skill level, that there's something that can be challenging but achievable. And I'm curious to see, because that's been a huge debate in these types of games for a long time now about whether or not they should have difficulty settings or should not have difficulty settings. I'm always going to go for the hardest difficulty in a game like this. So for me, go nuts with easier difficulties, but I know where I'm going to go to challenge myself, and it's going to be right to that hard mode setting. I wonder if they'll do a hardcore mode. Not permadeath, just something that, they have easy casual, maybe hardcore or something like that. And then, let's see, I struggled with the last battle. Yeah, and then they just talk about how satisfying it is to actually beat the last battle, of which I agree. It's not too easy and can seem difficult, but I feel like it'll become more enjoyable as you understand how to defeat enemies. It's incredibly well balanced. Really appreciate. Yeah, this is just more, hey, this is how it was for us. One big thing here is the interviewer says they like to take advantage of openings my allies created for me with their attacks. Did you have different allies than I did or something? Because yeah, I guess occasionally that happened, but I never appreciated it. Pleasantly surprised because they were useless most of the time, sure. But an interesting thing, the members of the development team said they shouldn't even be party members. And I kind of agree after the demo. So unless they do a lot of really good work with the party members going forward, I'll be on the side of those development team members who said that. But they decided because it's Final Fantasy, we have to have a party. I don't think that's a good reason. As much as I think that is a correct assessment of how people think of Final Fantasy games, if it's not done well, let's see. Please do well if you really plan to include them, and that becomes an important thing. They also ask about giving commands to them or customizing them. Right now, they're not really sure. They're going to get feedback from the demo, so make sure you play it and give feedback. But at the very least, customize their growth, their equipment, things like that. They also have certain things they excel at. They even mention how, Jed is a thief and Ash is a monk. So their different play styles should really play into the type of equipment you give them and how they act in the actual combat. For example, making them so they take an attack so you can actually finish casting a more powerful spell. Now they get into equipment, and while there's only a few questions here about the equipment, they are quite insightful. In the trial version, there's 4 weapons. 3 weapons, a great sword, a mace, and a spear. There is also technically a shield, but they're not including that, which each have an associated job. Sort of. Warrior can also wield a spear. But moving on. How many other types of weapons will appear in the game? And they give us an answer. There will be 8 weapon types in total. The weapon types that don't appear in the trial version are the one-handed sword, the axe, knuckles, daggers, and katanas. Knuckles and daggers we expected because of Jed and Ash. I obviously wanted them anyway. Axe, not too surprising either. One-handed sword is pretty standard. And katana, that last one, is particularly interesting. I'm wondering if they mean a two-handed katana or if they mean a more traditional one-handed katana. I'm going to assume they mean a two-handed katana, and that samurai will be one of the jobs, because I just want it to be that as an answer. This kind of already tells us, thief and ninja are very likely in. That wouldn't be too surprising given Final Fantasy I's job advancement. Some sort of samurai or bushido job likely with the katana. Knuckles, they've already mentioned monk by name. Axe, couple of options. We already have Warrior. Berserker becomes open as an option, honestly, with Axe, or Viking is another really old one from Final Fantasy. One-handed sword has tons of potential. There's Paladin, Red Mage, and they even make mention of those down here. Is the mace the only weapon that can use magic? And no, they said other weapons like the one-handed sword can use magic. If you picture like Knight, which is Paladin, or Red Mage, that might give you an idea. Already dropping more names. I expected maybe 6 to 8 jobs total in this game. There's currently 3 in the demo, and with 5 more, 8 to 9 does still seem to be a good place to guess, not including the fact that there will likely be a basic version of every job and an advanced version of every job. So we're getting a lot more insight into what jobs we can expect to see and how we can start to imagine how they would play in this kind of setting. They also talk about the ability to swap between 2 battle sets, you know, the combination of job and equipment, and why they decided to do this. And I actually kind of like the reason. Frequently upgrading your equipment is actually really fun when it comes to these style of games. So being able to swap between battle sets mid-combat gives you more equipment that you can collect, more upgrades that you can look forward to, especially if you're willing to experiment with the multitude of jobs that are actually available. It may not just be about finding a weapon that is your favorite and trying to build stuff around that. You may genuinely like a certain job combination or another job combination. And that's, again, the freedom to play how you want is a big thing here. So I actually think when they put it like that, it makes a lot more sense. Even though I thought it worked perfectly fine before, it just makes more sense to hear it like that. Well, people can experiment with this new kind of Final Fantasy action through their strategies and experiences. For example, maybe actually looking at the enemy formation and surroundings, consider your own position, deciding how to best use the abilities of the 2 different jobs. Similar to if you were walking through the overworld and you knew there was a specific layout of enemies, but you could kill it with 1 AoE spell, or you could kill it with just a few basic attacks without using that many resources. Understanding that is really the thing they want to be key here. How many types of equipment are there? I love this answer. Ino says, I thought you might ask, so I counted them. And there's a lot. I like Nomura's just like, wait, you counted them and that's your answer? And Nomura's like, yeah, I have to check all the outfit designs, so there's quite a lot. I just thought it was funny that he counted and then refused to give the number. Can you change your allies' equipment? Yeah, they mentioned that earlier, changing their loadout. There's even some equipment that Jack can't use so that the allies have these more powerful items to make them more influential in battle. So again, if you're going to go that route, they better be really good items, because I'm going to be really upset when I get something that I can't wear that looks really, really cool. So you're going to have to get the balance right on that one. In the trial version, only Jack's equipment can be changed. The trial trailer, the demo, like all that stuff is all in his default initial costume, but which means you'll be able to share equipment with your allies in the full game. However, Jack can use all the jobs and equipment it's so weird right here. I'm assuming they just mean every weapon type, since that's what the actual question is. But it's like he can use all equipment right after this says that some of strong equipment that Jack can't use. So I'm assuming this is just answering the every weapon type question. Then talking about the release date, they talk about the music. We already went over this. The main composer from Final Fantasy XI is the main composer here, Naoshi Mizuta, who we went over their music in a separate video. Also, Hidenori Iwasaki, who did Crystal Chronicles. I made sure to mention that in that video. But one thing, Ryo Yamazaki did World of Final Fantasy, which has a fantastic OST. Some of it borrowed from other Final Fantasy games, but some of the original tracks being quite strong. So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing the finished OST for Final Fantasy Origin. For the music, they just gave them basic instructions. They said, just challenge themselves to create something unlike they've done before. Cool. I think that for Mizuta, I can hear Mizuta things in there, but that it's still very much their own. Not to mention, of course, they do make mention of the fact that the refrain from the battle music in Final Fantasy 1 stands out. But apparently they asked the team not just to use it, but to adjust it to make sure it actually suits the game a little bit more. Then they move forward into talking about something that I always mention, but I kind of forget. Fujiwara and Ino are producer and director of the mobile game Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, my personal favorite mobile game. We've done tons of sponsored stuff for them in the past. I knew that they worked on that, but it kind of always slips my mind when I'm talking about the projects that Team Ninja and Koei Tecmo has worked on prior. And one thing they mentioned here is, do you want to put Jack in Opera Omnia? And they said, we work on both, so maybe one day. And Nomura's like, isn't that weird? Like, make a character and then be like, yeah, let's go put it in our other game, I guess. And I kind of get his point, but at the same time, I'd imagine that'd be quite exciting as a producer or director of 2 completely different titles. Then they get this just like last set of comments down here. talking about how they're looking forward to the feedback on the trial version and that they really plan to take it seriously and do whatever they can to actually improve the game based on what they receive. I'm sure the AI complaints are going to be the most massive thing people talk about in that feedback on the PlayStation 5 version. They talked about how the demo here, didn't work for a couple of days, but that they really hope that you enjoy the story and that the story is actually probably going to hit people quite emotionally. We'll see. Nomura is talking about how they only revealed information from the trial version, but that's really only the beginning of the game. Full game, more characters, broader, a more compelling story. It's going to be a little confusing for people when they see things at first because they're not going to be expecting it, but they hope that they'll keep an eye out for upcoming information. And you know what? They've been doing a good job so far. He also makes mention about how they extended the trial version, and please play it and provide feedback. Overall, I've been a big fan of the amount of information that Square Enix has been going out of their way to provide. I do really think it's because the initial reception was maybe underwhelming or downright negative when it comes to a lot of media outlets covering it until they played the demo. But the people who played the demo don't encompass everyone who actually got to see or play the game. A lot of people don't have PlayStation 5s, and not everyone watches YouTube or Twitch for gameplay or anything like that. So getting as much information out that can circulate as much as possible, I think, is a good idea. And hopefully they continue to do so, because it's given me a lot of YouTube videos to make, and it's given me a lot of things to look forward to when it comes to this game. Hoping it won't be like late 2022 at this point. But anyway, let me know what your thoughts are on the various comments from this interview. Be sure to put the comments in the comment section of the video below. Please like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned. We'll be covering anything and everything we can on Final Fantasy Origin. Anyway, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.